Imagine a quiet English village sometime in the 1950s. Children play in the lane outside a modest cottage. The neighbours know the occupant as a polite, reserved man with a slight accent he explains away as Dutch or Swiss. He tends his garden, keeps to himself and never speaks about his past. But beneath that calm, suburban surface lies one of the most explosive secrets of the Second World War. The man behind that cottage door had worn the black uniform of the Waffen-SS, had answered directly to Heinrich Himmler, and had once been branded a traitor by the most feared police state in human history. He should have been hanged. He should have been rotting in a Soviet prison camp or swinging from a gallows at Nuremberg. Instead, he was watering his geraniums in rural England, completely invisible to the world. How did he get there? How did he hide? And what happened when the past finally came looking for him? That is the story we are going to tell today. But to understand how one man could vanish so completely into the English countryside, we first need to understand the machine he had served, the machine he had betrayed, and the chaos of its destruction that made such an extraordinary escape possible. The Schutzstaffel, known to the world simply as the SS, began as a modest personal bodyguard for Adolf Hitler in the mid-1920s. It numbered just a few hundred men when Heinrich Himmler took command in January 1929. What Himmler built from that unpromising beginning is one of the most terrifying organizations in human history. By the height of the Second World War, the SS had grown into a vast empire of terror that encompassed the concentration camp system, the Einsatzgruppen death squads that murdered over 1 million people in the Soviet Union, the security and intelligence services of the Reich, and its own fully equipped field army. That field army, the Waffen-SS, numbered nearly 1 million men by 1944, drawn from every corner of occupied Europe and beyond. It included dedicated fanatics who had volunteered out of genuine ideological conviction, conscripts swept up in the later years of the war when manpower grew desperately short, and a motley collection of foreign volunteers ranging from Norwegian farmers to French aristocrats, Ukrainian nationalists, to most extraordinarily of all, British prisoners of war who chose to change sides. The Waffen-SS fought with a ferocity that its own generals boasted about openly, a ferocity that often crossed the line into atrocity. It massacred prisoners of war on the Eastern Front, hanged hostages in Italy and Yugoslavia, and burned villages in France. Its divisions accumulated an extraordinary combat record alongside an equally extraordinary record of war crimes. When Germany finally collapsed in the spring of 1945, the question of what would happen to nearly 1 million men who had served in this organization was one of the most pressing and complicated facing the victorious Allies. The answers that emerged over the following decades would astonish, anger, and in some cases deeply embarrass the governments tasked with delivering justice. And somewhere in the middle of all those tangled fates, hidden in plain sight in the green English countryside, one man's story stood apart from all the rest. In this video, we will find out how it happened. So without further ado, let us start with the first name on our list. Josef Sepp Dietrich entered the world on May 28, 1892, in the small Bavarian town of Hauangen, the son of a minor official. He was a stocky, pugnacious man who left school early and drifted through a series of labouring jobs before the First World War gave him a purpose and, to his considerable surprise, a talent. He served in the Imperial German Army with distinction, rising to the rank of sergeant and earning several decorations including the Iron Cross First and Second Class. After the war, like so many veterans of the trenches, he found civilian life impossible to navigate and threw himself into the political violence of the early Weimar Republic, joining the Freikorps and later the fledgling Nazi Party. His relationship with Hitler was intimate from the earliest days. He was one of the men who participated in the failed Beer Hall Putsch of November 1923, and when Hitler built his personal bodyguard into the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler in the early 1930s, it was Dietrich who he chose to command it. The Leibstandarte became the model for the entire Waffen-SS, an elite formation of tall, physically perfect Aryan warriors who were also expected to be ideological true believers, men who would carry out any order without hesitation or question. Dietrich commanded the Leibstandarte through the invasions of Poland, France, Greece and Yugoslavia, and it was with him at its head that the division entered the Soviet Union in June 1941. The Eastern Front was where the Leibstandarte's reputation for ruthlessness was most brutally established. Under Dietrich's command, the division participated in the massacre of Soviet prisoners of war and the killing of civilian hostages, actions that would follow him all the way to the courtroom after the war. In the autumn of 1944, Dietrich was given command of the 6th SS Panzer Army, which Hitler tasked with leading the massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes that the world came to know as the Battle of the Bulge. As Dietrich's forces pushed westward in December 1944, troops of the 1st SS Panzer Division under the overall SS umbrella massacred approximately 84 American prisoners of war near the Belgian village of Malmedy, in an incident that would become one of the most notorious war crimes committed against American soldiers in the entire conflict. Dietrich always maintained that he bore no direct responsibility for the Malmedy massacre, and that he had not ordered it. Many historians have remained deeply skeptical of that claim. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, Dietrich was captured by American forces. He was tried in 1946 specifically for the Malmedy massacre at the Dachau trials, found guilty, and sentenced to life imprisonment. However, his sentence was progressively reduced as West German political pressure, Cold War pragmatism, and the lobbying of veterans' organizations began to reshape the landscape of post-war justice. He was released in 1956 after serving just 10 years, a fact that caused outrage among survivors of the massacre and the families of the men he had commanded. He retired to Ludwigsburg, became involved in the veterans' lobby, and died on April 21, 1966, at the age of 73, having never faced a German court for the crimes of the Leibstandarte on the Eastern Front. Moving from one notorious commander to another, the story of Kurt Meyer, known to his men as Panzer Meyer, is in many ways even more disturbing precisely because of how close the wheels of justice came to crushing him before reversing direction entirely. Born on December 23, 1910, in Yerxheim, Saxony, Meyer was a dedicated Nazi from his youth, joining the SS in 1931, while still in his early 20s. He commanded a reconnaissance battalion in France in 1940 and reportedly ordered the shooting of captured Belgian soldiers, an act that would resurface after the war with devastating legal consequences. On the Eastern Front, he commanded SS units that participated in the brutal anti-partisan campaigns and the systematic killing of Soviet prisoners. By June 1944 and the Normandy invasion, Meyer had risen to command the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, one of the most fanatical formations in the entire German order of battle. It was this division that was responsible for one of the most cold-blooded war crimes committed against Allied soldiers in the Western Campaign: the murder of Canadian prisoners of war at the Abbaye d'Ardennes, near Caen. In June 1944, at least 20 Canadian soldiers were executed at or near Meyer's headquarters, shot in the head at close range after being taken prisoner. Meyer was captured by Belgian partisans in September 1944, but escaped, was recaptured, and finally ended the war in American captivity. He was tried by a Canadian military court in December 1945, found guilty of ordering the murder of the Canadian prisoners, and sentenced to death. It was at this point that something remarkable happened. The Canadian general who had to confirm the sentence, General Charles Foulkes, commuted it to life imprisonment, a decision that remains controversial to this day. Meyer was transferred to a Canadian military prison and then to West German custody in 1951. In September 1954, he walked free, having served barely 9 years for crimes that had included ordering the execution of prisoners of war. He went on to become chairman of HIAG, the Waffen-SS veterans organization, and spent the remainder of his life arguing that the Waffen-SS had been soldiers like any other. He died on December 23, 1961, on his 51st birthday, still convinced that history had treated his division unfairly. The families of the Canadians he had murdered remembered it differently. Across the English Channel and through the fog of post-war Europe, one of the most extraordinary SS figures of the war had already made his escape while the shooting was still barely over. Léon de Grelle was born in Belgium on June 15, 1906, and spent his youth as a journalist and Catholic activist before falling headlong into the ideological intoxication of fascism in the 1930s. He founded the Rexist movement in Belgium, a fascist political party that achieved genuine electoral success before the war, and then threw itself enthusiastically into collaboration with the Nazi occupiers. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, de Grelle volunteered for the Waffen-SS, eventually commanding the 28th SS Volunteer Grenadier Division Wallonien, a formation composed of Belgian Walloon volunteers. Hitler was reportedly so impressed by de Grelle's performance on the Eastern Front that he once remarked, in what he presumably intended as a compliment, that if he had a son, he would want him to be like de Grelle. De Grelle himself was decorated with the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, one of the most prestigious combat decorations in the German military system. His war ended in dramatic fashion. As Germany collapsed in May 1945, de Grelle boarded a light aircraft and made a desperate flight from Oslo in Norway all the way to the coast of Spain, crashing on the beach of San Sebastian with a broken skull and multiple other injuries. He survived, and Francisco Franco's Spain provided the shelter he needed. For the next 50 years, de Grelle lived openly in Spain, refused every extradition request from Belgium, gave interviews in which he celebrated his SS service without the slightest apparent remorse, and died on March 31, 1994 at the age of 87, having never served a single day. In prison for his collaboration or his service in a force that committed mass atrocities across the Eastern Front. Belgium had sentenced him to death in absentia in 1944, but the sentence was never carried out. His survival and his brazen defiance of post-war justice make him one of the most outrageous examples of a senior SS figure escaping all consequences. Karl Nicolaus Leck was a man whose physical courage was never in any serious doubt, which made the manner of his post-war escape both ironic and revealing about the networks that protected fleeing SS men. Born in 1917 in South Tyrol, then still part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Nicolaus Leck grew up in the complex borderland culture of northern Italy and eventually joined the Waffen-SS, serving as a panzer officer with the Wiking Division on the Eastern Front. He was a genuinely decorated combat soldier, awarded the Knight's Cross for his actions in Ukraine in 1944, where he led a small armoured force in a series of daring actions that helped rescue encircled German troops. After the war, like a number of other SS officers with his profile, Nicolaus Leck disappeared from Europe altogether. He reached Argentina in 1948, arriving in a country whose president, Juan Perón, had made a calculated decision to offer shelter to large numbers of former Nazis in exchange for skills, capital, and geopolitical leverage against the Allied powers. Argentina in those years became a sanctuary for an astonishing number of former SS officers, and the networks that facilitated their arrival, the so-called rat lines that ran through neutral Spain and Portugal, through the international Red Cross offices that were insufficiently careful about issuing travel documents, and through sympathetic Catholic Church intermediaries who believed they were protecting anti-communist fighters from Bolshevik persecution, have been the subject of investigation and controversy ever since. Nicolaus Leck built a quiet life in Argentina, eventually becoming a successful businessman in the construction industry. He lived to an extraordinary age, dying in 2008 at 90 years old, which means he spent more than 60 years successfully evading any legal consequences for his SS service. His case illustrates how the rat lines were not merely a route of last resort for the most notorious criminals like Adolf Eichmann, but a well-used highway for hundreds of middle-ranking SS officers who might never have faced serious prosecution in any case, but who chose the safer option of a new life in a new hemisphere. Paul Hauser was one of those rare figures in the history of the Waffen-SS who could claim with some genuine basis that his trajectory into the SS had followed a certain military logic rather than pure ideological fanaticism, though the distinction becomes considerably harder to maintain when examined closely. Born on October 7, 1880 in Brandenburg an der Havel, Hauser was a professional soldier of the Wilhelmina era, who had served through the First World War and risen to the rank of lieutenant general in the regular German army before retiring in 1932. He joined the SS in 1934, when the organization was still in its relatively early stages of expansion, and he became one of the key architects of the Waffen-SS as a military force, insisting on proper military training and standards rather than pure political indoctrination. He commanded the SS Division Das Reich in France in 1940 and on the Eastern Front in 1941 and 1942, and later commanded SS Panzer Corps formations in the Titanic battles around Kharkov in early 1943, where his decision to abandon the city against Hitler's direct orders and then retake it in a sweeping counter-offensive became one of the most tactically admired maneuvers of the entire Eastern Front campaign, at least among military historians willing to evaluate it on purely operational grounds. After the war, Hauser was held in American captivity and testified at the Nuremberg trials, where his attempts to portray the Waffen-SS as a conventional military force were systematically demolished by the prosecution. He was released without being charged with any personal crimes, a fact that he and others in the SS Veterans Network treated as a vindication rather than a fortunate accident of evidentiary limitations. In 1951, Hauser became the founding president of HIAG, the Hilfsgemeinschaft auf Gegenseitigkeit der Angehörigen der ehemaligen Waffen-SS, the Mutual Aid Association of former Waffen-SS members. Through this organization, he spent the rest of his life constructing and promoting the myth of the Waffen-SS as an apolitical fighting force that had been unjustly condemned, a myth whose persistence in certain quarters of military publishing and online communities to this day represents one of his most damaging legacies. His 1953 memoir carried the title Soldaten wie andere auch, Soldiers Like Any Other, which became the founding document of this revisionist tradition. Hauser died on December 21, 1972, at the age of 92, having lived long enough to see his narrative become firmly established in the popular imagination of a certain segment of West German society. Otto Skorzeny was perhaps the most flamboyant personality produced by the entire SS system, a man so theatrically bold that his post-war escapes and escapades sometimes read more like the script of an adventure film than a historical document. Born on June 12, 1908, in Vienna, Skorzeny was a tall, powerfully built man whose face bore a prominent dueling scar, the legacy of a student fencing encounter that he carried with something approaching pride. He joined the Austrian Nazi Party in the 1930s and transferred his allegiance to the Waffen-SS when Germany absorbed Austria in 1938. His moment of genuine historical fame came in September 1943, when he led the daring glider-borne commando raid that snatched Benito Mussolini from his mountain prison at Gran Sasso, in the Italian Apennines. The operation was a genuine tour de force of small unit audacity, and it made Skorzeny internationally famous overnight. Hitler personally decorated him with the Knight's Cross the same day, and the Allied press, somewhat despite themselves, could not help noting the spectacular quality of the achievement. Skorzeny followed Gran Sasso with a series of other special operations, most notably Operation Greif during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, in which German soldiers wearing American uniforms and driving captured American vehicles attempted to sow confusion behind Allied lines. When he was captured by American forces in May 1945, he faced a military tribunal at Dachau in 1947, specifically for the alleged use of enemy uniforms during Operation Greif, which potentially violated the laws of war. In one of the most remarkable moments of the entire post-war trial process, Skorzeny's defence team produced a British officer, Wing Commander Yeo Thomas, himself a celebrated wartime operative who had worked behind German lines in civilian clothes, who testified that Allied special forces had engaged in similar practices. The tribunal acquitted Skorzeny. He was held for further denazification proceedings but escaped from a detention camp at Darmstadt in July 1948, reportedly with the assistance of former SS comrades disguised as American military policemen. He made his way to Spain, where he lived openly in Madrid under his own name, worked as a business consultant and bodyguard, and reportedly maintained connections with intelligence services of multiple countries. He died in Madrid on July 5, 1975, at the age of 67, another SS figure who had navigated the post-war legal landscape with startling success. His bold escape from custody and his comfortable life in Spain made him a legend among the dwindling community of SS veterans who celebrated such audacity as evidence of the continuing spirit of their wartime brotherhood. Ernst Kaltenbrunner is one of those figures whose very name, even decades after his death, carries a specific quality of dread. Born on October 4, 1903 in Riedem-Innkreis, Austria, Kaltenbrunner was a large and physically imposing man with a scarred face and an air of barely contained brutality that contemporaries found deeply unsettling. He joined the Austrian Nazi Party in 1930 and the SS in 1931, and his career advanced rapidly through the Austrian SS networks in the years before the Anschluss. When Germany absorbed Austria in March 1938, Kaltenbrunner's local knowledge and his existing connections within the Austrian underground Nazi movement made him immediately valuable to the Reich's security apparatus. But his ascension to real power came through one of the most dramatic moments of the war: the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich, the supremely intelligent and utterly ruthless chief of the Reich Security Main Office, the RSHA, who was mortally wounded by Czech partisans in Prague in May 1942 and died on June 4th of that year. When Heydrich died, the most powerful police and intelligence organization in the Third Reich was left without leadership. Heinrich Himmler cast around for a replacement who would be capable and loyal, but who would not, as Heydrich had occasionally shown signs of doing, develop independent ambitions. He settled on Kaltenbrunner in January 1943. Kaltenbrunner was not the strategically brilliant operator that Heydrich had been, but he was thorough, he was utterly committed to the ideology, and he had no political ambitions beyond serving Himmler and the Reich. Under his direction, the RSHA supervised the deportation and murder of hundreds of thousands of Hungarian Jews in 1944, coordinated the operations of the Einsatzgruppen, ran the Gestapo, and managed the network of concentration camps with bureaucratic precision. Kaltenbrunner was captured by American forces on May 12, 1945, hiding in an alpine hunting lodge in the Austrian mountains, still wearing civilian clothes. At the main Nuremberg trial, he was the senior surviving SS officer and the only one of the major defendants whose personal involvement in specific acts of mass murder could be documented in overwhelming detail. He was convicted on charges of war crimes and crimes against humanity and hanged in the gymnasium of Nuremberg prison on October 16, 1946, at the age of 43. His execution, along with those of the other condemned men that same morning, was the closest the post-war justice system came to delivering anything resembling proportionate punishment for the crimes of the SS leadership. Walter Schellenberg could not have been more different from Kaltenbrunner in either appearance or personality, and their differences illuminate something important about the range of human types the SS managed to attract and retain. Born on January 16, 1910, in Saarbrücken, Schellenberg was slight, elegant, highly intelligent, and possessed of a gift for navigating complex social environments that made him a natural intelligence operator. He studied law before joining the SS in 1933 and quickly found his métier in the security and intelligence branches of Himmler's empire. He rose rapidly, partly through genuine talent and partly through a facility for telling his superiors exactly what they wanted to hear while quietly protecting his own position. By 1944, he was head of the SD's Foreign Intelligence Department, the Amt 6, which made him in theory the equivalent of a foreign intelligence chief for the entire Nazi state. What makes Schellenberg's story particularly relevant to the theme of betrayal within Himmler's inner circle is what he did in the final stages of the war. As Germany's defeat became increasingly obvious, Schellenberg began quietly working to undermine Himmler's resistance to the idea of negotiated peace. He cultivated a relationship with Count Folke Bernadotte of the Swedish Red Cross, and it was through Schellenberg's brokering that the famous meeting between Bernadotte and Himmler took place in April 1945, the meeting at which Himmler, behind Hitler's back, offered to negotiate a separate peace with the Western Allies. When news of Himmler's treachery reached Hitler, it produced one of his most extreme rages of the entire war. From Hitler's perspective, it was Himmler who was the traitor. But from Himmler's perspective, and that of the SS faithful, it was Schellenberg who had led him into the disaster, who had whispered the siren song of escape and negotiation into the ear of the Reichsführer SS. When Germany surrendered, Schellenberg was arrested by the British, and he cooperated extensively with Allied intelligence services, providing detailed accounts of SS operations, personnel, and foreign contacts. At the subsequent Nuremberg Ministries trial in 1949, he was convicted of membership in a criminal organization and sentenced to 6 years imprisonment. His sentence was commuted, and he was released in June 1951 on the grounds of ill health. He spent his final months in Switzerland and Italy, completing his memoirs and died on March 31, 1952, at the age of 42. His case represents a category of SS figure that post-war justice found particularly difficult to handle. The intelligent operator who had served the regime wholeheartedly, but whose cooperation was so valuable to the victors that it inevitably softened the eventual reckoning. Oskar Dirlewanger stands in a category almost entirely his own, among the figures of the Waffen-SS, and that category might be described simply as uniquely monstrous even by the standards of an organization whose standards were already appalling. Born on September 26, 1895, in Würzburg, Dirlewanger was a genuine oddity in the SS hierarchy, a man with a criminal record that included a conviction for sexual assault on a minor, an academic doctorate in political science, and a fanatical commitment to violent ideology that overrode every normal social restraint. He had served in the First World War with genuine distinction and then drifted through the chaos of Weimar Germany before his criminal conviction ended any prospect of a conventional career. His rehabilitation came through the patronage of Gottlob Berger, one of Himmler's key lieutenants, who decided that Dirlewanger's particular combination of violence, recklessness, and fanaticism made him ideal for commanding a unit composed of convicted criminals and social outcasts, a formation that would carry out anti-partisan operations so brutal that even regular Wehrmacht and SS units sometimes lodged formal protests about what they witnessed. The Dirlewanger Brigade, later expanded to divisional strength, was deployed in occupied Poland, Belarus, Ukraine, and finally in Warsaw, where during the suppression of the Warsaw Uprising in August 1944, it committed atrocities so extreme that they shocked even battle-hardened contemporaries. Entire districts of the city were burned with their inhabitants still inside. Hospitals were cleared with machine guns and flamethrowers. Women and children were killed alongside fighters. The International Military Tribunal later classified the suppression of the Warsaw Uprising as one of the worst single episodes of mass murder in the entire war. Dirlewanger was captured by French troops in June 1945 and died in their custody under circumstances that remain disputed, with reports suggesting he was beaten to death by his Polish guards on June 7, 1945, at Altshausen in Baden-Württemberg. He was 49 years old. Given the nature and scale of his crimes, the manner of his death, though extrajudicial, attracted rather less outrage than might otherwise have been the case. Herbert Kappler was the head of the SS and SD security apparatus in Rome during the German occupation of Italy, and his name is permanently associated with one of the most carefully premeditated mass murders of the entire Italian campaign. Born on September 23, 1907 in Stuttgart, Kappler was a professional police officer who had joined both the Nazi Party and the SS in 1931 and built a career in the security services throughout the 1930s. His posting to Rome in 1939 as the German police attaché gave him years to develop the networks and knowledge of the Italian capital that he would later deploy in the service of mass murder. On March 23, 1944, a bomb placed by Italian partisans in the Via Rasella in central Rome killed 33 German SS policemen. Hitler ordered immediate reprisals at a ratio of 10 Italians for every German killed. Kappler was tasked with selecting and organizing the victims for what became the Ardeatine Cave Massacre. On March 24, 1944, 335 Italian civilians and prisoners were taken to the Ardeatine Caves on the outskirts of Rome, shot in groups in the back of the head, and then buried by explosions that collapsed the cave entrances over their bodies. The victims included Italian political prisoners, Jews, resistance members, and ordinary men who happened to be held in the city's prisons on the wrong day. The massacre was documented in meticulous detail by Kappler's own records. After Italy's liberation, Kappler was tried by an Italian military tribunal in 1948, convicted of the murder of 335 people and sentenced to life imprisonment. He served his sentence in the military prison at Gaeta and then at Celio Military Hospital in Rome, where in August 1977 his wife smuggled him out of hospital in a suitcase, a remarkable and almost comic escape from custody that caused a major diplomatic incident between Italy and West Germany. Kappler had been diagnosed with terminal cancer, which made his escape a matter of limited practical consequence since he died in Soltau, West Germany, on February 9, 1978, less than 6 months after his escape. Jochen Peiper was the single most significant individual Waffen-SS officer. connected to the Malmedy massacre that we mentioned in connection with Sepp Dietrich, and his long post-war story encapsulates many of the most troubling aspects of how West Germany and the broader Western world dealt with SS war criminals in the Cold War decades. Born on January 30th, 1915 in Berlin, Piper was the very model of a young SS officer as Himmler envisioned them. Tall, physically perfect by the racial standards of the time, highly intelligent, utterly committed, and completely ruthless. He had served on Himmler's personal staff before moving to the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, where he built a reputation as one of the most aggressive and effective armoured commanders on the Eastern Front. His units were accused of numerous atrocities in the Soviet Union, including the burning of villages with their inhabitants trapped inside and the murder of Soviet prisoners of war on multiple occasions. But it was his command during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 that would define his post-war fate. As Kampfgruppe Piper, his armoured battle group, drove westward through Belgium, soldiers under his command stopped near the crossroads of Baunau and shot approximately 84 American prisoners of war, who were standing in a field with their hands raised. The Malmedy massacre was one of the most serious war crimes committed against American soldiers in the entire war. Piper was tried at the Dachau-Malmedy trial in 1946, found guilty, and sentenced to death. However, his sentence, like those of the other Malmedy defendants, became entangled in one of the most damaging controversies of the entire post-war justice process, when allegations emerged that the prosecution had obtained confessions through improper means, including mock trials, physical coercion, and psychological pressure. A Senate subcommittee investigation followed, and while the findings were disputed, the political damage was severe enough that the sentences of the Malmedy defendants were progressively commuted. Piper was released from Landsberg prison in December 1956 after serving 11 years. He worked briefly for the automobile industry in West Germany, and then, finding that his wartime reputation made normal employment impossible in Germany, moved to the village of Travers in the French Jura region in 1972. Where he lived under his own name, translating military books and living quietly. In the summer of 1976, French communist newspapers revealed his identity and location, producing a wave of outrage among French war veterans and resistance members. On the night of July 13th to 14th, 1976, exactly 32 years after the liberation of Paris, Piper's house in Travers was attacked, set on fire, and burned to the ground. His body was found in the ruins. He was 61 years old. No one was ever charged with his killing. Whether his death represented justice, delayed, or murder, and whether there is any meaningful distinction between those categories in his case, is a question that historians and ethicists continue to debate. Rudolf Höss may be the most chilling case study in all of the post-war SS reckoning. Not because of the manner of his punishment, which was in its own grim way appropriate, but because of the clarity with which he explained and even seemed to take pride in the system he had constructed. Born on November 25, 1900, in Baden-Baden, Höss came from a deeply Catholic family whose patriarch had intended him for the priesthood. The First World War intervened, and Höss served as a soldier from 1916 onwards, becoming one of the youngest non-commissioned officers in the German army. After the war, he drifted into right-wing paramilitary violence, participating in the Freikorps and eventually being convicted of murder for his role in a political killing in 1923. He was released in 1928 and worked as a farmer before joining the SS in 1934 at the urging of his Freikorps comrades. His career in the SS led him inevitably toward the concentration camp system, and in May 1940 he was appointed commandant of a new camp being constructed on the grounds of a former Polish army barracks near the town of Oswiecim in occupied Poland, a place the Germans called Auschwitz. What Höss built at Auschwitz over the following years was the largest killing facility in human history. By the time of his transfer to other duties in November 1943, Auschwitz had processed hundreds of thousands of victims, and the network of gas chambers and crematoria he had designed and overseen were operating at industrial scale. He was recalled in May 1944 specifically to oversee the deportation and murder of the Hungarian Jewish community, an operation that saw over 400,000 people murdered in approximately 8 weeks, a rate of killing that represents one of the most concentrated episodes of mass murder in recorded history. After the German surrender, Höss disguised himself as a naval petty officer and worked on a farm in Schleswig-Holstein for several months before British investigators, acting on information extracted from his wife under interrogation, arrested him in March 1946. What happened next was remarkable even by the standards of the Nuremberg proceedings. Höss testified voluntarily and in extraordinary clinical detail about every aspect of the operation of Auschwitz, providing documentation that has remained central to historical scholarship ever since. He was transferred to Polish custody, tried before a Polish court in Warsaw, convicted and executed by hanging on April 16, 1947, at the age of 46, on the very gallows he had once ordered constructed at Auschwitz. The symmetry of his death and the location where it occurred gave it a historical weight that a more conventional execution would have lacked. Otto Ohlendorf was one of the intellectuals of the Nazi genocide, a man whose biography raises the most uncomfortable questions about the relationship between academic intelligence and moral catastrophe. Born on February 4, 1907, in Hoheneggelsen in Lower Saxony, Ohlendorf studied law and economics, earning a doctorate, and showed every sign of being a man destined for a distinguished academic or professional career. He joined the Nazi Party in 1925 while still a teenager, well ahead of the opportunistic surge of membership that followed Hitler's rise to power, which marks him as a genuine early believer. He joined the SS in 1936 and built a career within the SD, the Intelligence and Security Branch, rising to become head of the SD's Domestic Intelligence Department. But it was his wartime assignment that placed him among the architects of the Holocaust. From June 1941 to June 1942, Ohlendorf commanded Einsatzgruppe D, one of the 4 mobile killing units that followed the German army into the Soviet Union and systematically murdered the Jewish population of occupied territories. Under his command, Einsatzgruppe D killed approximately 90,000 people in the southern Soviet Union and Crimea during that single year. At the Einsatzgruppen trial at Nuremberg, Ohlendorf was one of the most striking defendants, not because he denied what he had done, but because he explained it with an almost academic detachment that profoundly disturbed the court and the observers. He acknowledged the killings, justified them on ideological grounds, and argued that his men had followed orders he had been obliged to transmit. He was convicted of crimes against humanity and sentenced to death. He was hanged at Landsberg prison on June 7, 1951, at the age of 44, along with 3 other Einsatzgruppen commanders, in one of the last executions carried out by the Allied occupation authorities in Germany. His composure in the face of death and his continued insistence on the ideological correctness of his actions made him one of the most disturbing witnesses to his own crimes in the entire history of the post-war trials. Heinrich Himmler was the head of the Gestapo, the secret state police of the Third Reich, and he remains the only senior Nazi leader whose fate after the war is completely unknown, a mystery that has generated decades of speculation, investigation, and conspiracy theory. Born on April 28, 1900 in Munich, Müller was a career policeman rather than an ideological crusader, a man whose professional competence in the brutal mechanics of political repression made him indispensable to the Nazi security apparatus, even though he had not joined the Nazi Party until 1939, years after Hitler came to power. He rose to head the Gestapo in 1939 and held that position until the very end, supervising the arrest, torture and murder of political opponents, the enforcement of racial laws, the deportation of Jews to the extermination camps, and the hunt for resistance operatives across occupied Europe. He was last seen alive in the Führer bunker in Berlin on May 1, 1945, the night after Hitler's suicide, and then he vanished. Entirely, his subsequent fate has never been established beyond any reasonable doubt. Various theories have placed him in the Soviet Union, working for KGB predecessor organizations in the immediate post-war years. Others have suggested he died in Berlin during the final fighting and was buried in a mass grave. A 1963 excavation of a Berlin cemetery uncovered a grave marker bearing his name, but forensic examination of the remains was inconclusive, and subsequent DNA testing in later decades produced complicated and disputed results. The CIA's own investigation files on Müller, released decades after the war, reveal the frustrating reality that multiple intelligence services hunted him for years without success. The possibility that one of the most senior architects of the Holocaust simply walked away from the ruins of the Third Reich and lived out a long life under an assumed identity somewhere in the world is profoundly disturbing. And the inability to resolve the question definitively stands as one of the most significant failures of post-war justice. Karl Wolff presents a case that illustrates how collaboration with Allied intelligence could provide extraordinary insulation against post-war prosecution. Born on May 13, 1900 in Darmstadt, Wolff was a polished aristocratic figure whose elegant manners and social intelligence made him an unusual personality within the SS hierarchy. He served as Himmler's personal chief of staff from 1936 to 1943, which placed him at the very center of the SS command structure during the most intensive period of the Holocaust's implementation. He was personally involved in facilitating the deportation of Jews from Warsaw to the Treblinka extermination camp in 1942, writing enthusiastic letters to the Reich railway authorities about accelerating the transportation program. He was aware of and involved in the administration of the entire SS empire during the years when that empire's primary function was systematic mass murder. Yet Wolff survived the post-war period with remarkable comfort, at least initially. The key to his protection was his role in Operation Sunrise, the secret negotiations in early 1945 between SS and German military commanders in Italy and the American OSS, led by Allen Dulles, to arrange a surrender of German forces in northern Italy before the general armistice. Wolff was the German side's primary contact in these negotiations, and his cooperation was considered sufficiently valuable by American intelligence that it provided him with significant insulation from prosecution in the immediate post-war years. He was called as a witness at Nuremberg rather than tried as a defendant, and he was processed through the denazification system and released in 1949 with a relatively modest finding. It was only in 1962, 17 years after the war's end, that a West German prosecutor re-examined his role in the Warsaw deportations and other crimes in sufficient detail to bring charges. He was tried in Munich, convicted in 1964 and sentenced to 15 years imprisonment. He was released in 1969 after serving only a portion of that sentence. He died on July 15, 1984, at the age of 84, in Prien am Chiemsee in Bavaria, yet another SS figure who had navigated the post-war decades with a combination of intelligence, good connections, and a willingness to cooperate with the right people at the right moment. Felix Kirsten occupies a deeply ambiguous position in the history of the SS's post-war legacy, being simultaneously one of the most unlikely figures in Himmler's inner circle and one of the most controversial claimants to the title of Saviour. Born on September 30, 1898, in Dorpat, in what was then the Russian Empire, Kirsten was a Finnish citizen of German Baltic extraction who had trained as a physician and developed expertise in a form of manual therapy that his patients described as extraordinarily effective for a range of conditions, including chronics, headaches, and various forms of nerve pain. His crucial moment came in 1939 when he was introduced to Heinrich Himmler, who suffered from severe psychosomatic complaints, including terrible stomach cramps that conventional medicine had been unable to treat. Kirsten's treatments provided Himmler with remarkable relief, and the Reichsführer SS became deeply dependent on his masseur in a manner that granted Kirsten extraordinary personal access. Over the course of the war, Kirsten used that access in ways that have been credited, though also disputed, with saving thousands of lives. He interceded with Himmler on behalf of Dutch citizens, Jewish prisoners, and political detainees on numerous occasions, and in the final weeks of the war he was involved in negotiations through Swedish channels that resulted in the release of approximately 7,000 Scandinavian concentration camp prisoners through the White Buses operation. After the war, Kirsten lived in Sweden and the Netherlands, where he was celebrated as a humanitarian hero. However, his claims about the number and nature of his interventions were contested by, among others, the Dutch historian Louis de Jong, who questioned whether Kirsten had exaggerated both his influence over Himmler and the scale of his interventions. The debate over Kirsten's true role has never been fully resolved, and he remains one of those figures in the SS's orbit whose moral status depends entirely on which version of his story you choose to believe. He died in Hamburg on April 16, 1960, at the age of 61, with his reputation still contested. The story of what happened to the men of the Waffen-SS in the years immediately after the German surrender cannot be understood without understanding the sheer scale of the logistical challenge facing the Allied powers. In the weeks of May and June 1945, American, British, French, and Soviet forces had to process, house, feed, and eventually make decisions about millions of German prisoners of war, a population that included at least 600,000 men who had served in some capacity within the Waffen-SS, from the ideologically committed early volunteers of the Leibstandarte through the conscripts of the later war years and the foreign volunteers drawn from across occupied Europe. The immediate Allied policy was clear. The SS as an organization had been declared criminal by the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, and all its members were therefore in principle subject to prosecution. But prosecuting 600,000 men was an obvious impossibility, and the Allied powers found themselves having to make pragmatic distinctions based on rank, documented crimes, and the practical capacity of their legal systems. Most ordinary Waffen-SS soldiers were processed through standard prisoner of war channels and released, often within months. Men with no documented involvement in specific war crimes, particularly those who had been conscripted rather than volunteering, were frequently given only minor classification in the denazification system and returned to civilian life with their records marked but their freedom intact. It was only for higher-ranking officers and those with documented involvement in specific atrocities that more serious legal proceedings were initiated, and even those proceedings were subject to the complications we have already seen: evidentiary challenges, health grounds, political pressure, and the softening effect of Cold War pragmatism as West Germany became an essential partner in the containment of Soviet power. The conditions in which Waffen-SS prisoners found themselves in the chaotic summer of 1945 varied enormously depending on who held them captive. Those taken by the Western Allies were generally held in prisoner of war camps that, while overcrowded and austere, operated within a recognizable framework of the Geneva Convention's provisions, at least for rank and file prisoners. The situation for those captured by the Soviet Union was categorically different. Soviet prisoner of war camps in the immediate post-war period were characterized by high mortality rates from disease, starvation, overwork, and, in some cases, direct killing. Soviet forces had little interest in distinguishing between Waffen-SS soldiers and other categories of German prisoner, and the brutal conditions of Soviet captivity claimed the lives of tens of thousands of SS men in the years between 1945 and the gradual repatriation of survivors that continued well into the 1950s. Some Waffen-SS prisoners were not released by the Soviet Union until 1955 and 1956, a decade after the war's end, by which time many of their comrades in Western captivity had long since been released and were rebuilding their civilian lives. The disparity in treatment between East and West became a powerful propaganda tool for the SS veterans' lobby in West Germany, which argued that the different standards of justice applied by different occupying powers demonstrated the arbitrariness of the entire post-war reckoning with the SS. By 1948 and 1949, as the Federal Republic of Germany took shape under Allied supervision, the practical question of how to reintegrate the hundreds of thousands of former Waffen-SS men into the new German society had become impossible to avoid. The new state's economy was rebuilding rapidly, and it needed workers, entrepreneurs, and skilled professionals. Many former SS men had significant technical and managerial experience, and the blanket exclusion of 600,000 men and their families from economic participation was both practically unworkable and politically explosive. West Germany's conservative political parties, keenly aware of the electoral arithmetic of a large and well-organized veterans community, began to push back against the most stringent aspects of the Allied denazification program. The result was a series of compromises that allowed former Waffen-SS men to claim limited pensions, seek certain kinds of employment, and gradually reintegrate into mainstream society, provided they had not been personally convicted of specific war crimes. In 1953, Chancellor Konrad Adenauer's public declaration that Waffen-SS men had fought as soldiers like any other marked the high watermark of this political rehabilitation, a statement that survivor organizations and the families of millions of victims found deeply offensive, but that reflected a calculated political decision about the priorities of West German reconstruction. Would any of these men actually admit what they had done, what they had been part of, what the organization they had served had accomplished in the name of an ideology they had once championed? That question would haunt the Federal Republic for decades, and the different answers given by different individuals illuminate the full moral spectrum of post-war human behavior. The HIAG organization, which we encountered briefly in the context of Paul Hauser and Kurt Meyer, deserves more detailed examination because it represents one of the most successful exercises in historical revisionism of the entire post-war period. An exercise whose effects are still visible today in certain corners of military history publishing and online communities. Founded in 1951, HIAG's full name: the Hilfsgemeinschaft auf Gegenseitigkeit der Angehörigen der ehemaligen Waffen-SS, translated as the Mutual Aid Association of former Waffen-SS members, was deliberately chosen to emphasize its welfare functions while obscuring its political objectives. Its founders, primarily senior former SS officers, including Hauser, Felix Steiner, and Otto Kumm, were men who had commanded divisions and corps and who brought to the organization the same organizational energy and strategic thinking that had characterized their military careers. Each HIAG's central claim was simple but audacious. The Waffen-SS had been a military force like any other. Its men had been soldiers doing their duty under the laws and conditions of war, and the Nuremberg verdict declaring the SS a criminal organization had been a politically motivated injustice imposed by victorious enemies rather than a legitimate legal finding. To support this argument, HIAG promoted specific historical narratives, funded the publication of memoirs and unit histories that emphasized combat operations while minimizing or omitting war crimes, and lobbied politicians at both state and federal level for measures that would improve the legal and social status of its members. Its magazine Der Freiwillige, meaning the volunteer, became the primary vehicle for this revisionist history, and it published for decades, maintaining the narrative that the Waffen-SS had been a European volunteer army fighting communism rather than an ideological arm of a genocidal state. The political connections HIAG developed were extensive and occasionally embarrassing. West German politicians attended HIAG rallies. Franz Josef Strauss, one of the most powerful conservative politicians of the Adenauer era, addressed veterans' gatherings. Local mayors permitted commemorative events at which former SS officers celebrated their wartime service without acknowledgement of the crimes committed by their formations. The political influence of HIAG peaked in the 1950s and into the 1960s, before the wider cultural transformation that accompanied the student movements of 1968 began to shift the terms of public debate about Germany's Nazi past. The generation that came of age in the late 1960s was far less willing to accept the comfortable silences and strategic amnesias of their parents' generation, and the revelations of the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials of 1963 to 1965, which brought detailed testimony about the operation of the death camps to a German public that had largely managed to avoid confronting this material directly, created a new climate of historical interrogation that HIAG was ill-equipped to withstand. By the 1970s, investigative journalists were systematically dismantling the organization's claims, and a 1978 Der Spiegel investigation revealed the extent of HIAG's political machinations and its systematic efforts to pressure the government on pension reforms in a way that made clear its true function was advocacy rather than welfare. Mainstream political parties began publicly distancing themselves from HIAG events, and the organization's membership declined as its founding generation aged and died. It formally dissolved in 1992, by which time most of its members were in their 70s and 80s, and its public credibility was essentially gone. But the mythology it had spent 4 decades constructing proved considerably more durable than the organization itself, persisting in certain military history publications, in online communities, and in the historical consciousness of those countries where locally recruited SS formations had been, reframed as national resistance movements against Soviet occupation. The story of HIAG and its political connections raises an important question about the women who had been connected to the SS's leadership. For their post-war experiences often intersected in complex ways with the networks of mutual support and historical denial that organizations like HIAG and Stille Hilfe maintained. Stille Hilfe, meaning silent aid, was a secretive organization founded in 1951 to provide practical and financial support to arrested, condemned or fugitive former SS members and their families. Its connections to senior figures in West German society were extensive and murky, in roughly equal measure, and its activities included providing funds for legal defense, helping families of convicted war criminals, and in some cases, assisting fugitives who had avoided capture after the war. The most famous member of Stille Hilfe in later decades was Gudrun Himmler, the only child of Heinrich Himmler himself, who was born on August 8, 1929, and who, despite the overwhelming historical documentation of her father's role in the Holocaust, never wavered in her support for his memory. Gudrun had been devoted to her father during his lifetime. Heinrich had maintained an unusually close relationship with his daughter, telephoning her daily when they were apart, writing her weekly letters, and bringing her along to observe SS functions in ways that even some of his colleagues found inappropriate for a child her age. She called him Papi, and he called her Pupi, a nickname that survived throughout the war. After Germany's defeat, Gudrun and her mother were arrested by American forces and held in a series of camps in Italy, France, and Germany before being summoned to Nuremberg to testify and subsequently released in November 1946. Unlike some children of senior Nazis who spent their adult lives wrestling with their father's legacies and eventually coming to public positions of confrontation and condemnation, Gudrun Himmler remained loyal to her father's memory throughout her entire adult life. She contested the historical consensus that Heinrich Himmler had committed suicide by biting into a hidden cyanide capsule when captured by the British, insisting instead that he had been murdered. She became increasingly involved with Stille Hilfe as the decades passed, eventually becoming one of its most prominent figures, attending trials of accused war criminals to show support for the defendants, and working behind the scenes to provide practical assistance to the network of former SS men and their families who remained connected to each other through the organization's activities. She died in 2018 at the age of 88, having spent more than 7 decades refusing to accept the historical verdict on the man whose name she bore and whose legacy she protected with fierce and unwavering loyalty. Margarete Himmler, Heinrich's wife, presents a rather different trajectory. Through the post-war decades, though one that intersects in interesting ways with the broader patterns of denial and reintegration we have been examining. Born in 1893, Margarete was trained as a nurse and had managed a private nursing clinic before meeting Heinrich Himmler during one of his lecture tours in 1927. Their marriage in 1928 was complicated from the beginning by the age difference between them, by Heinrich's introduction to Margarete's Catholic family, and by the growing dominance of Nazi politics in both their lives. Margarete became a member of the Nazi Party in 1928 and used her position as the Reichsführer's wife to pursue her own social and organizational activities within the regime, eventually achieving the rank of colonel within the German Red Cross. Her diary entries from visits to occupied Poland in 1940 reveal attitudes toward the Polish and Jewish populations that were consistent with the ideology of the regime she supported so enthusiastically. After Germany's defeat, Margarete was subjected to extensive investigations into the extent of her knowledge of her husband's activities. She consistently denied awareness of the Holocaust and the operation of the concentration camps, a claim that historians have treated with considerable skepticism given the social world she moved in and the official functions she performed during the war. After prolonged proceedings, a 1953 denazification court finding classified her as a profiteer of the Nazi regime and sentenced her to 30 days of penal labour, stripping her of her voting rights and her pension eligibility. She subsequently lived under the pseudonym Margarete Boden, attempting to distance herself from a name that had become permanently associated with mass murder, and died in 1967. Her case illustrates the broader pattern of wives and female relatives of senior Nazi figures who faced relatively limited legal consequences, despite their extensive involvement in and benefit from the regime, consequences so minimal that the word inadequate barely begins to describe them. Moving to the complex terrain of Eastern Europe, the question of foreign volunteers who had served in the Waffen-SS takes on particularly sharp political dimensions that have never been fully resolved. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, Himmler's Waffen-SS began recruiting volunteers from occupied and allied countries across Europe, motivated by a combination of ideological fervour and practical manpower requirements as the scale of the campaign on the Eastern Front became apparent. Dutch and Flemish volunteers formed early units that evolved into the Wiking and later the Nederland and Langemarck divisions. Norwegian volunteers served in the Nord Division. French volunteers formed the Charlemagne Division. And in the Baltic states, Ukraine, and elsewhere in the formerly Soviet-occupied territories, men who had lived under Soviet occupation and who framed their SS service as a fight against Bolshevik tyranny rather than a commitment to Nazi ideology joined in substantial numbers. The 15th and 19th Waffen-Grenadier divisions of the SS were composed of Latvian volunteers and conscripts, and the 20th Waffen-Grenadier division of the SS was Estonian. These formations fought primarily on the Eastern Front against the Soviet Army, and their post-war status became entangled in the complicated politics of Baltic identity, Soviet occupation, and the Cold War in ways that continue to generate controversy for decades after the war's end. For the Soviet Union and its successor states, these men were traitors who had collaborated with the Nazi invader and committed crimes against the Soviet people. For many in the Baltic states, particularly after the restoration of independence in 1991, they were patriots who had fought against one totalitarian occupation, even if their alliance with another was morally compromised. Annual commemorative marches in Riga honouring Latvian. Waffen-SS veterans became a flashpoint of controversy well into the 21st century, drawing condemnation from Jewish organizations, the European Parliament, and the governments of Russia and Israel, while being defended by Latvian government officials on the grounds of national historical memory. The story of Italian SS volunteers, smaller in scale but equally complex in its moral dimensions, illustrates how Himmler's organization swept up men of vastly different backgrounds and motivations in the final desperate years of the Reich. After Italy's armistice with the Allies in September 1943 split the country between the liberated South and the German-occupied North, a significant number of Italian fascists chose to continue fighting alongside their German allies rather than accept the Allied victory or collaborate with the new Italian government that emerged in the South. Some of these men joined the Italian Social Republic of Benito Mussolini in northern Italy, and a smaller number were recruited into the Waffen-SS, serving in units like the 29th Waffen-Grenadier Division of the SS Italy. These Italian SS men fought until Germany's final defeat in May 1945, and then faced the particular difficulties of post-war Italy, where collaboration with the German occupation was viewed as an especially acute form of betrayal. Some fled to South America through the rat lines that had served German and Austrian SS fugitives. Others simply changed their identities and disappeared into the complicated social geography of post-war Italy. A few eventually faced justice, though Italian post-war prosecutions of collaborators were generally limited, and the amnesties issued by the new Italian state in the late 1940s provided cover for many who might otherwise have faced serious legal consequences. Among the most audacious escape stories from the entire post-war SS reckoning is the case of Erich Priebke, an SS officer whose successful disappearance for nearly 50 years represents one of the most extraordinary failures of post-war justice and one of the most damning indictments of the rat-line networks that facilitated so many similar escapes. Born on July 29, 1913 in Hennigsdorf, Brandenburg, Priebke was a career SS officer who served as a Hauptsturmführer in the SS and SD apparatus in Rome during the German occupation. He was deeply personally involved in the Ardeatine Cave massacre that we discussed in connection with Herbert Kappler. While Kappler selected and organized the victims as the overall commander, it was Priebke who personally kept count of the victims being shot and who, when the count reached 330, went back and shot 5 additional men because of a mathematical error that had produced more victims than the precise ratio of 10 Italians for every German killed required. He shot them himself personally to make the numbers work. After Germany's defeat, Priebke made his way to Argentina through the rat line route that also served other SS fugitives, assisted by a network that included Bishop Alois Hudal, an Austrian bishop based at the German church in Rome, who had made himself available as a facilitator for escaped Nazis seeking ecclesiastical documentation. Priebke settled in the Argentine town of Bariloche, where he lived openly under his own name, working as a delicatessen owner and school principal, and serving as a prominent member of the local German expatriate community. He gave a television interview to an American journalist in 1994 in which he acknowledged his presence at the Ardeatine Caves and admitted he had shot 2 men, though he defended his actions as having been carried out under orders. The broadcast created an international sensation and led to his extradition to Italy. The legal proceedings that followed were tortured, complicated, and deeply unsatisfying to the victims' families. Priebke was initially convicted in 1996, but the verdict was technically structured in a way that meant he could not be imprisoned, producing riots outside the courtroom. Eventually, following appeals, he was convicted of murder with mitigating circumstances in 1998 and sentenced to 15 years imprisonment, immediately commuted to house arrest given his age, 85 at the time of the final verdict. He died under house arrest in Rome on October 11, 2013, at the age of 100, having spent approximately 48 years of freedom between the end of the war and his extradition, and another 17 years in comfortable house arrest rather than prison. No Italian prison ever held him. His death produced the bizarre spectacle of Argentine and Italian authorities refusing to allow his burial in their respective countries due to protests, leaving his remains in a legal limbo for several years. Alois Brunner was the man Adolf Eichmann called his best man, the SS officer he regarded as the most efficient and ruthless operative in the entire apparatus of the final. Solutions implementation. Born on April 8, 1912 in Neighbours in what was then Austria-Hungary, Brunner joined the SS in the mid-1930s and was assigned to work under Eichmann in the Jewish Affairs section of the SD. It was Brunner who organised the mass deportations of Jews from Austria, Greece, France and Slovakia to the extermination camps, personally supervising operations that sent tens of thousands of people to their deaths. He was responsible for the deportation of approximately 47,000 Viennese Jews, nearly 44,000 Greek Jews from Thessaloniki and elsewhere, approximately 23,000 French Jews from transit camps in France, and thousands more from Slovakia. His methods were characterized by exceptional brutality even by the standards of the final solutions implementers, with reports of severe physical violence against deportees at every stage of the process. After Germany's defeat, Brunner fled to Syria, where he lived under the alias of Georg Fischer in Damascus, with the knowledge and protection of the Syrian government. France convicted him in absentia in 1954 and again in 2001. And West Germany issued arrest warrants, but Syria refused all extradition requests and Brunner lived in Damascus with apparent official protection for decades. Israeli intelligence tracked him but never succeeded in capturing him as they had captured Adolf Eichmann in Argentina in 1960. 2 letter bomb attacks, one in 1961 and one in 1980, cost him 4 fingers on one hand and the sight of one eye, but failed to kill him. He was last reportedly seen in the 1990s. His death, if it has occurred, has never been officially confirmed, and he was for a time the world's most wanted Nazi war criminal, still at large. Some reports suggest he died in Syria around 2001. Others suggest later dates, but no definitive confirmation has ever been provided. His case represents the absolute nadir of post-war accountability. A man responsible for the deaths of over 100,000 people who appears to have died in comfortable obscurity, protected by a sovereign state, having never faced any legal consequences whatsoever for crimes of almost incomprehensible scale. Adolf Eichmann stands apart from all the other cases we have examined, not because his crimes were necessarily greater than those of Himmler or Kaltenbrunner or Heydrich, but because his capture and trial in 1961 and 1962 became one of the defining moments in the world's understanding of the Holocaust and of the nature of bureaucratic evil. Born on March 19, 1906 in Solingen, Eichmann was a thoroughly unremarkable man in most respects, a mediocre student, a failed salesman, a man with no particular talents or distinguishing characteristics beyond a gift for administrative organization and a complete absence of independent moral judgment. He joined the Austrian Nazi Party and the SS in 1932 and attached himself to the Jewish Affairs desk of the SD in 1934, where he developed genuine expertise in the organization of Jewish emigration from Germany. As the war began and the regime's approach to the Jewish question shifted from forced emigration to mass murder, Eichmann's organizational abilities were applied to the logistics of deportation and killing on a continental scale. He was the desk officer who coordinated the timetables, the transport, the paperwork, and the bureaucratic communication between the various agencies involved in the deportation of Jews from every country under German control or influence, from Norway to Greece, from France to Hungary. He attended the Wannsee Conference in January 1942 as a secretary and recorded its minutes. He organized the final deportations of Hungarian Jews in 1944 and 1945, pushing them forward even as the war was clearly lost. After Germany's defeat, Eichmann lived under the alias Ricardo Clement in Argentina, settling with his family near Buenos Aires. He was located by the Mossad, Israel's intelligence service, in 1960, kidnapped in a daring covert operation on May 11th of that year, and brought to Israel to stand trial. His trial in Jerusalem in 1961 was broadcast on television and watched by millions of people around the world, becoming the first time that many viewers had been directly confronted with the full scale and systematic nature of the Holocaust through the testimony of survivors. Eichmann conducted his own defense, arguing that he had been an administrative official following orders rather than a driving force of the genocide. He was convicted of crimes against the Jewish people, crimes against humanity, and war crimes, sentenced to death, and hanged in Ramla prison on June 1, 1962. He was the only person to be executed by the State of Israel. His trial, and the philosophy of evil as bureaucratic compliance that the political theorist Hannah Arendt articulated in her famous book about it, profoundly shaped the world's understanding of how ordinary people participate in extraordinary crimes. The Eichmann trial had reverberations throughout West Germany and across the former SS community that are impossible to overstate. For the SS veterans who had built their post-war lives on the narrative of having been simple soldiers following orders, the spectacle of Eichmann's trial demolished that comfort entirely. Here was a man who had articulated precisely that defense, who had presented himself as a bureaucrat, a cog in the machine, a man who had simply processed paperwork, and that defense had been systematically dismantled by the evidence of what his paperwork had actually accomplished. For the members of HIAG and the networks of former SS officers who gathered at their regular reunions, the Eichmann trial represented a catastrophic rupture in the carefully maintained narrative of the clean fighting soldier. It was now impossible to claim that the deportation of millions of Jews to extermination camps had nothing to do with the Waffen-SS, because the administrative machinery that had made those deportations possible had been part of the same organizational structure as the military formations, whose veterans were arguing for rehabilitation. The logical and moral connections were too visible to deny. And yet, many continued to try because the alternative, accepting full moral and historical responsibility for belonging to an organization that had participated in one of the greatest crimes in human history, was simply too psychologically catastrophic for men who had built their identities and their social worlds around a different story. Within this landscape of denial and reckoning, a very small number of former SS figures chose a radically different path, one of public confession and active atonement, and their stories are as important to understand as those of the deniers and the escapers. Oskar Groening was not a senior officer, but an ordinary SS man who served as an administrator at Auschwitz, processing the currency and valuables stolen from arriving deportees. He was not a guard who participated directly in killings, but he was fully aware of what was happening at the camp, and he had reported witnessing the murder of a group of Jewish children during his time there. For decades after the war, Groening lived quietly in Lower Saxony, working for a glass company, and he did not speak publicly about his time at Auschwitz. But as he aged, he became increasingly disturbed by the activities of Holocaust deniers who argued that the extermination camps had not existed, and in 2005, in an interview with Der Spiegel, he broke his silence entirely. He described in detail what he had seen and done at Auschwitz, explicitly acknowledged the criminality of the operation, and stated that he bore moral guilt for his participation, even if his legal guilt was a matter for the courts. He was prosecuted, and in 2015, at the age of 93, was convicted as an accessory to the murder of 300,000 Hungarian Jews and sentenced to 4 years imprisonment. He died in March 2018 at the age of 96 before serving his sentence. His decision to speak out at whatever personal cost stands as one of the few genuinely honourable acts in the entire post-war history of SS members' engagement with their past. The question of what happened to the children of senior SS figures deserves consideration alongside the fates of the officers themselves, because the children inherited not only the surname and the social stigma, but also in some cases the continuing personal and psychological weight of a parent's choices. We have already examined Gudrun Himmler's case, in which the daughter of the Reichsfuhrer became one of the most devoted defenders of his memory and one of the most active participants in the networks of mutual support that kept the SS community together across the post-war decades. But other children of SS leaders chose radically different responses to their inheritance. Nicholas Frank, the son of Hans Frank, who had served as the Nazi governor-general of occupied Poland and had presided over the murder of millions of Polish Jews, spent his adult life publicly denouncing his father in the most explicit and unsparing terms. He published a book, In the Shadow of the Reich, in which he described his father as a criminal and a coward, and expressed his relief that the Nuremberg tribunal had sentenced him to death by hanging, which was carried out on October 16, 1946. Frank toured with his book, speaking at schools and universities, confronting German audiences with the most uncomfortable possible version of his family history. His approach was controversial because of its extremity, but it represented the opposite end of the moral spectrum from Gudrun Himmler's lifelong defense of her father, illustrating that the children of perpetrators faced real choices about how to engage with a history that had been made for them before they were old enough to understand it. Rolf Mengele, son of the Dr. Josef Mengele, who had conducted grotesque medical experiments on prisoners at Auschwitz, had a story that occupies particularly disturbing territory. Born on March 16, 1944, Rolf was raised with the understanding that his father had died in the war, a fiction maintained by the family to protect the fugitive Josef Mengele, who had fled to South America through the Ratline networks and was living under assumed identities in Argentina, Paraguay, and eventually Brazil. When Rolf eventually learned the truth as a teenager and began to understand the nature of his father's crimes, he experienced the kind of psychological earthquake that such a revelation inevitably produces. In 1977, driven by a complex mixture of curiosity, filial obligation, and perhaps a desperate need to confront the reality directly, he traveled to Brazil and met his father for the first time in decades. He found a man who showed no remorse for the experiments he had conducted on prisoners at Auschwitz, who attempted to justify them on pseudo-scientific grounds, and who remained convinced of his own intellectual superiority and the correctness of the ideology in whose service he had operated. Rolf Mengele later described this meeting as one of the most disturbing experiences of his life. Despite his revulsion at his father's continued lack of repentance, he kept the location of the elder Mengele's Brazilian hideout secret until Josef Mengele drowned in the sea at Bertioga in February 1979 at the age of 67. Josef Mengele had escaped all judicial consequences for his crimes, one of the most notorious SS criminals to die in complete freedom. Rolf subsequently changed his name, became an attorney, and attempted to build a life separated from the burden of his father's identity. Edda Göring, the only child of the Luftwaffe chief and senior Nazi Hermann Göring and his actress wife Emmy Sonnemann, faced her own unique version of this, inheritance. Born in 1938, she was barely old enough to form childhood memories of her father's powerful position in the regime, but old enough to be profoundly shaped by the social catastrophe of its collapse. Hermann Göring was convicted at the main Nuremberg trial and sentenced to death, escaping the gallows only by committing suicide with a hidden cyanide capsule on the night before his scheduled execution in October 1946. Ida was left with a tainted name, a famous father's image that she could not escape, and a collection of valuable artworks and gifts that had been accumulated through a process the post-war courts viewed as straightforward looting. She lost most of the legal battles over these artworks in the 1960s. Unlike her contemporary Nicholas Frank, Edda Göring never engaged in public reflection or condemnation of her father. In a 1986 Swedish television interview, she broke her habitual public silence only to express her affection for both her parents, a statement that was received with understandable criticism given the historical context. She spent most of her life away from the public eye and died in 2018, leaving behind what one obituarist described as a life permanently defined by a father she barely knew but could never escape. As the post-war decades passed and West Germany's economic miracle created a new generation of comfortable middle-class citizens, the social memory of the SS and its crimes underwent a process of compartmentalization that psychologists and sociologists who have studied this period find deeply revealing. Many former SS men lived out their lives in West German towns and cities, working in factories, running small businesses, serving as teachers and local officials, without ever being called to account for what they had been part of. Their neighbours often knew or suspected their wartime histories, but exercised a collective silence that was partly social convention, partly the desire not to disturb a recovered normality. and partly a more calculated decision not to open questions that might implicate many others in the same community. It was not until the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials of 1963 to 1965, in which 22 former Auschwitz personnel were tried in a West German court for the first time, that German society was directly confronted with detailed testimony about the operation of the death camps delivered in a German courtroom to German judges applying German law. The impact of those trials on the West German public was profound, particularly for the younger generation that had grown up knowing very little about what had actually happened in the camps their parents' generation had administered and staffed. The trials became a catalyst for a generational revolt against the silence of the Adenauer era, and began the long, painful, still incomplete process of German historical reckoning with the SS and its crimes. The Wiesenthal Center and its eponymous founder Simon Wiesenthal deserve specific acknowledgement in any account of how post-war justice caught up or failed to catch up with SS perpetrators. Wiesenthal was himself a Holocaust survivor who had lost most of his family to the camps and who emerged from the liberation of Mauthausen concentration camp in May 1945 with a driving commitment to ensuring that the perpetrators did not escape accountability simply by outliving the immediate post-war reckoning. He established his documentation center in Vienna and spent nearly 6 decades hunting Nazi criminals through a combination of archival research, informants, and persistent pressure on government authorities across multiple countries. His most famous success was providing crucial information that led to the capture of Adolf Eichmann, though the precise extent of his contribution to that case has been the subject of historical debate. He also contributed to the eventual capture of Franz Stangl, the commandant of the Treblinka extermination camp, who had escaped to Brazil through the rat lines and was living there as a Volkswagen factory worker when Wiesenthal's investigations led Brazilian police to him in 1967. Stangl was extradited to West Germany, tried, convicted of being jointly responsible for the murder of 900,000 people, and sentenced to life imprisonment in 1970. He died of heart failure in Düsseldorf prison on June 28, 1971, just 6 months after his conviction, having served less than a year of his life sentence. Wiesenthal continued his work until 2003, by which time most of the surviving perpetrators were so old that prosecution had become effectively impossible. He died on September 20, 2005 at the age of 96, having dedicated the last 60 years of his life to a form of justice that, as he often acknowledged, remained perpetually incomplete. The British dimension of the SS story, which brings us at last toward the extraordinary central narrative promised by our title, begins in a place few people would expect. The Channel Islands, the only British territory occupied by Nazi Germany during the entire Second World War. The Channel Islands, comprising Jersey, Guernsey, Alderney, Sark, and several smaller islands, fell under German occupation in June and July 1940, following the British government's decision not to defend them militarily, a decision that has been controversial in British historical memory ever since. For the nearly 400,000 British civilians living on the islands, the occupation meant 5 years of German administration, rationing, forced labour demands, and the deportation of a small number of Jewish residents to concentration camps from which few returned. The experience of occupation also produced, as all occupations do, a spectrum of human responses ranging from active resistance through passive survival to varying degrees of accommodation and collaboration. It was from the Channel Islands that one of the most bizarre and disturbing British contributions to the Waffen-SS emerged, the story of men who chose to join the German forces outright, crossing every conceivable line of national loyalty and personal ethics in a decision whose motivations remain complex and disputed even today. Can you imagine being a British citizen wearing the insignia of the SS, an organisation officially declared criminal by an international tribunal? Some men did exactly that, and their post-war fates are as varied and complicated as the men themselves. The British Free Corps was a unit of the Waffen-SS composed of British and Dominion subjects, formally established by the German government in January 1944, though recruitment efforts had been ongoing since 1943. Its official name was the Britisches Freikorps, and it was designed to appeal to British prisoners of war and civilians in occupied territories who might be persuaded to join what the German propaganda apparatus presented as a crusade against Bolshevism in defense of European civilization. The unit was enthusiastically promoted by John Amory, the son of the British colonial secretary Leo Amory, whose broadcasts on behalf of the German government were among the most notorious acts of wartime collaboration by a British national. But the unit itself attracted very few genuine recruits. At its peak, it numbered perhaps 60 men, a pathetically small formation that was never committed to actual combat and spent most of its existence as a propaganda exercise, photographed in their SS uniforms for publications designed to demoralise the British public and undermine morale. The collar patches of the British Free Corps featured the Union Jack alongside the SS runes, one of the most deeply contradictory images produced by the entire war. Yet the men who wore those patches were real, their choices were real, and the consequences they faced after the war's end varied in ways that illuminate the unevenness of British justice in dealing with its own wartime traitors. John Amory was in many ways the most prominent and the most tragic of the British SS figures, not because his wartime activities were the most operationally significant, since they amounted to little more than propaganda broadcasts and recruitment speeches, but because his family background and the nature of his trial made his case an object of intense public attention. Born on March 14, 1912, the son of Leo Amory, a prominent conservative politician who served as Secretary of State for India and Burma in Churchill's wartime cabinet, John Amory had spent his pre-war years careening through a series of business failures, legal difficulties and personal scandals in France and Spain. He was a man of genuine intelligence combined with spectacular irresponsibility, and his commitment to fascist ideology was complicated by what observers described as a significant degree of self-deception and a tendency to pursue whatever cause might provide him with a sense of purpose and significance. During the Spanish Civil War, he had supported Franco, and by the time the Second World War began, his political sympathies were firmly with the Axis. He made his first radio broadcast for Germany in November 1942, calling on British soldiers to lay down their arms, and subsequently toured prisoner of war camps in Germany, attempting to recruit British soldiers for the formation that would become the British Free Corps. He was captured by Italian partisans in April 1945 and handed over to British authorities. At his treason trial at the Old Bailey in London on November 28, 1945, he pleaded guilty after just 8 minutes of proceedings, a decision that prevented the calling of extensive evidence and therefore denied the court and the public a full examination of his activities. He was sentenced to death and hanged at Wandsworth Prison on December 19, 1945, at the age of 33. His father, who had spent the war years in the same cabinet as Winston Churchill, was present in the House of Commons when the news was reported. The case remains one of the most poignant examples of how the extremities of the war era could fracture even the most apparently stable social institutions. Thomas Haller Cooper was another British national who had joined the Waffen-SS, though his route there was rather different from Amory's, and his post-war fate considerably less severe. Born in 1919 in Oxford, Cooper was a garage mechanic before the war who had developed strong fascist sympathies through his involvement with Sir Oswald Mosley's British Union of Fascists in the late 1930s. When the war began, Cooper volunteered for the SS rather than the British Armed Forces and made his way to Germany, where he served as a member of the SS, including time with the British Free Corps after its formation in 1944. After Germany's defeat, Cooper was arrested by British forces and tried for treason at the Old Bailey in June 1945. He was convicted and sentenced to death, but his death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment, and he was subsequently released in 1953 after serving 8 years. He returned to civilian life in Britain, changed his name, and managed to build a relatively normal existence, working and living in England until his death in 1999. His case illustrates how the British legal system, like its German counterpart dealing with Waffen-SS veterans, ultimately found room for mercy and rehabilitation, even for men who had committed the most fundamental act of betrayal their country's legal system could contemplate. Roy Nicholas Corlander was a British soldier from the Rhodesian forces who had been captured in North Africa and who subsequently agreed, under circumstances he later described as involving considerable pressure and the promise of better treatment, to join the British Free Corps. His participation was minimal, and he largely spent his time avoiding any actual activity within the unit, but his membership was enough to result in a treason conviction after the war. He received a sentence of 15 years penal servitude, which was reduced on appeal, and he was eventually released and returned to Rhodesia. His case typifies a category of British Free Corps member whose commitment to the SS cause was thin at best, performative at worst, and driven more by the desperate calculus of a prisoner of war trying to survive than by any genuine ideological conviction. The British courts, having to sentence these men under treason law, which in its most severe application mandated death, found themselves having to make distinctions of degree that the law itself did not make elegantly, struggling to distinguish between genuine traitors and desperate men who had made terrible decisions under extreme duress. And then there was Eric Pleasance. Born on May 8, 1915 in Norfolk, England, Pleasance was one of the most physically remarkable men in England in the pre-war years, a professional strongman and physical culturist who had performed throughout Europe as a circus and vaudeville attraction, bending iron bars, supporting enormous weights, and demonstrating feats of strength that drew astonished crowds wherever he appeared. He had developed his extraordinary physique through years of dedicated training, and he possessed, alongside his physical gifts, an ebullient personality and a gift for self-promotion that made him a natural performer. He was also possessed of an independent spirit that made him somewhat resistant to conventional authority, a quality that would define the extraordinary series of choices he made during the war years. When the German forces occupied the Channel Islands in 1940, Pleasance was living on Jersey. Unlike the vast majority of Channel Islanders who simply submitted to the occupation and attempted to continue their lives as normally as possible, Pleasance found the experience of occupation psychologically impossible to tolerate. He made several attempts to escape the island and reach mainland Britain, all of which were unsuccessful. He was caught and imprisoned by the Germans, and it was during this imprisonment that the truly extraordinary chapter of his life began. Rather than simply sitting out the war in custody, Pleasance began cultivating relationships with his German captors, partly through the novelty value of his physical prowess, which attracted considerable interest from German soldiers who watched his training exercises with astonishment. He was eventually approached with a proposal. Would he consider joining the British Free Corps? Would this extraordinary British strongman consent to wear the black uniform of the Waffen-SS in exchange for his freedom? What would you do, faced with that choice in that place, at that moment? Eric Pleasance said yes. He joined the British Free Corps, underwent SS training, and found himself in a position of extraordinary moral complexity. A British citizen in Nazi uniform on German territory, technically fighting for a cause he had never believed in against a country that was his own. His subsequent experiences within the Waffen-SS were in many ways typical of the British Free Corps generally. A great deal of waiting around, limited actual military activity, and considerable embarrassment on the part of the German military authorities, who were not entirely sure what to do with 60 English-speaking men who were simultaneously valuable as propaganda and awkward as operational soldiers. By the time the war ended, Pleasance had the distinction of not having fired a shot in anger on behalf of the Third Reich, though he had worn its most notorious uniform. He was captured, however, not by the British, but by the Soviet Red Army, which had a considerably different approach to the niceties of distinction between ideological commitment and circumstantial collaboration. For the Soviets, a man in an SS uniform was an SS man, full stop. Pleasance was taken into Soviet captivity, where he spent the next several years enduring the brutal conditions of the Soviet prisoner of war system. He worked in various camps, survived through a combination of his extraordinary physical resilience, his instinct for finding ways to make himself useful to his captors, and a degree of luck that he himself readily acknowledged. He was interrogated, reclassified again, and eventually found himself in a situation that Soviet bureaucracy found difficult to process. A British national who had served in the German SS, held in a Soviet camp, whose repatriation to Britain raised awkward questions about what the British authorities would do with him. He was eventually released and returned to Britain in the late 1940s, where he faced the consequences of his wartime choices. What happened when Eric Pleasance came home to England is the heart of the story that our title promises, and it is in many ways more interesting than anything that had preceded it. Back in Britain, he was technically liable to prosecution for treason, since his membership of the British Free Corps, an SS formation, constituted at minimum a case to be answered. However, the British authorities, by the time of his return, were in a complicated position. They had already prosecuted and executed John Amory, and they had convicted and imprisoned several other British Free Corps members. The question of what to do with Pleasance was complicated by the particular circumstances of his case, his Channel Islands background, the questions about how freely his original SS recruitment had been chosen, the fact that he had served in Soviet captivity for years rather than returning to Britain in triumph, and the broader public exhaustion with war crimes proceedings that characterized the late 1940s and early 1950s. The decision was made not to prosecute him. Eric Pleasance walked back into British civilian life without standing trial, and he made a choice that many men in similar positions have made. Throughout history, he kept quiet. He settled in Norwich, the city of his native county, found work, built a domestic life, and became to all external appearances exactly what his neighbours assumed him to be. A quiet, somewhat reserved man with a slight Northern English accent and no particular remarkable history. He was precisely the man in the English village who tended his garden and said little about his past. For years, for decades, the full story of what he had done and where he had been remained unknown to the world outside a small circle of authorities who had processed his case and chosen not to pursue it. He became a ghost, haunting his own biography, a man whose outward normality concealed one of the most extraordinary personal histories in the entire story of what happened to the men of Himmler's SS after 1945. His story might have remained permanently buried had it not been for a journalist and author named John Watson, who tracked Pleasance down in Norwich in the 1970s, and after extensive conversations, helped him produce a memoir of his wartime experiences. The book, published in 1977 under the title I Killed to Live, gave the public its first detailed account of what a British member of the Waffen-SS had actually experienced. The reception was complicated, as one might expect. Veterans' organisations were outraged. Some historians questioned certain details. Others found it an invaluable primary source on a genuinely obscure aspect of the war. Pleasance himself, by this point in his 60s, seemed to have reached a kind of settled peace with his own history, not the defiant denial of a man like Leon de Grelle or the active mythology building of the HIAG generation, but a more complicated acknowledgement that he had made choices under impossible circumstances that he could not change and had to live with. He died in Norwich in 1989 at the age of 73, having spent approximately 40 years as an ordinary English resident whose neighbours, in his village and later his Norwich street, had no idea they were living beside a former member of the Waffen-SS, who had spent time in Soviet captivity and had once been the most physically powerful man in the Channel Islands. His case raises questions that go to the heart of what we mean by justice, identity, and the possibility of reinvention after catastrophic moral failure. Was Eric Pleasance a traitor? Technically and legally, yes, at least under British law as it was written at the time of his SS membership. Was he a committed Nazi ideologue? By all available evidence, absolutely not. Was he a man who made a terrible decision under circumstances of extreme duress and then spent the rest of his life carrying the weight of it in private while the world continued around him entirely unaware? That seems to be the most accurate description available. The English village where he hid was not a geographical hiding place in the manner of Leon de Grelle's Madrid or Alois Brunner's Damascus, but a psychological and social one, the ordinary texture of a civilian life so unremarkable that it became its own form of concealment. In that sense, his story is representative of a much larger truth about the post-war fate of the men of Himmler's SS. The most successful forms of hiding were not the dramatic escapes to South America or the forged identities in foreign countries, but the quiet reintegration into the fabric of ordinary European life. The decision to say nothing, to remember nothing publicly, and to let the passing years do the work of forgetting. The story of Eric Pleasance is remarkable for its specificity and its intimacy, for the way it brings the grand catastrophe of the SS and its aftermath down to the scale of a single human life lived out in the most ordinary of English settings. But it is also representative of something much larger. The fundamental incompleteness of post-war justice in relation to the men of Heinrich Himmler's organisation. To understand that incompleteness fully, we need to look at the broader landscape of what happened to those who remained in Germany and Austria, who did not flee to South America or Spain, who did not manage to disappear into English anonymity, but who stayed and attempted to rebuild their lives in the countries whose destruction their service had helped complete. The denazification process that the Allied powers implemented in occupied Germany from 1945 onwards was, in theory, one of the most comprehensive efforts at societal transformation in modern history. The occupying powers divided Germany into 4 zones, each administered by one of the principal Allied nations, and established tribunals in each zone that were charged with classifying every adult German according to their degree of involvement with the Nazi regime. The classification system recognized 5 categories ranging from major offenders at the top through offenders, lesser offenders, and followers down to exonerated. Persons at the bottom. In theory, major offenders faced the most serious consequences, including imprisonment and permanent exclusion from certain types of employment. In practice, the process was immediately overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the task, the shortage of qualified personnel to conduct the hearings, and the overwhelming incentive facing German witnesses to characterize their colleagues as followers rather than offenders. The resulting system produced what German commentators derisively called the Persilschein, a reference to the Persil washing powder brand, a certificate of denazification that effectively whitewashed its holders' wartime activities regardless of the actual degree of their involvement. For former Waffen-SS men, the denazification process was particularly fraught. On one hand, the International Military Tribunal's declaration that the SS was a criminal organization created a legal presumption of guilt for all its members. On the other hand, the practical impossibility of seriously prosecuting hundreds of thousands of former soldiers, the political pressure from conservative West German politicians representing their constituents, and the Cold War imperative of integrating West Germany as rapidly as possible into the Western Alliance, all pushed in the direction of lenient classification and rapid reintegration. Men who had commanded SS divisions on the Eastern Front, who had transmitted the orders that resulted in mass murder, who had administered the concentration camp system, found themselves classified as lesser offenders or followers in proceedings that lasted a matter of hours, and that treated their testimony about their own activities as largely credible. They paid modest fines, served their mandatory periods of what was often more symbolic than actual restriction, and returned to civilian life within a few years of the war's end. The contrast between this outcome and the experiences of the victims of SS atrocities was so extreme as to be genuinely difficult to comprehend. Survivors of the concentration camps faced years of physical and psychological recovery, the overwhelming grief of losing virtually everyone they had known, the practical difficulties of rebuilding a life in a world that had been physically and socially destroyed. Many had no home to return to, no community, no family, no property, no documentation of their pre-war existence. The compensation programs established by the West German government in the 1950s and 1960s were real but inadequate, and the bureaucratic obstacles placed in the path of claimants were often so discouraging that many survivors simply gave up attempting to navigate them. The post-war decade was one in which the perpetrators returned to their communities and rebuilt their lives, while many survivors were still in displaced persons camps, still stateless, still trying to find somewhere in the world that would accept them. This temporal and moral inversion, in which recovery came more quickly and more completely to those who had committed the crimes than to those who had suffered them, represents perhaps the most fundamental failure of post-war justice. Franz Stangel's story, which we touched on briefly in connection with Simon Wiesenthal, deserves more detailed examination because it so perfectly illustrates the pattern of flight, comfortable obscurity, and eventual late justice that characterized the fate of so many senior SS criminals. Born on March 26, 1908 in Altmünster, Austria, Stangl had served as a police officer in Austria before being assigned to the euthanasia program that killed tens of thousands of disabled German and Austrian citizens between 1939 and 1941. He was then transferred to the occupied Soviet territories as part of Operation Reinhard, the program to murder all the Jews of occupied Poland, and in September 1942 he was appointed commandant of Treblinka, the extermination camp in eastern Poland that was responsible for the murder of between 700,000 and 900,000 people. Stangl ran Treblinka with what he described as professional attention to operational efficiency, and he reportedly wore his white riding jacket at the camp as a kind of personal trademark. He had absolute command over a facility whose sole purpose was the murder of every human being who arrived at it, and he exercised that command for over a year before Treblinka was closed and demolished in an attempt to hide the evidence of its existence. After the war, Stangl was arrested but escaped from custody in 1948 and fled, with his family, through the rat line networks via Syria to Brazil, where he worked at the Volkswagen factory in Sao Paulo. Simon Wiesenthal tracked him down through a combination of informants and archival research, and in 1967, Brazilian police arrested him. He was extradited to West Germany, tried before a Düsseldorf court, and convicted in 1970 of being jointly responsible for the murder of 900,000 people, sentenced to life imprisonment. He died 6 months later, on June 28, 1971, in Düsseldorf prison. He was 63 years old. He had spent 22 years living freely in Brazil, working, raising his family, living a comfortable middle-class life, while the legal process that eventually found him guilty of the largest individual tally of murder in the history of criminal prosecution slowly worked its way toward him. Gustav Wagner, who served alongside Stangl as a deputy commandant at the Sobibor extermination camp, presents an equally disturbing case of delayed or denied justice. Born in 1911 in Bavaria, Wagner was one of the most brutal individuals within the Operation Reinhard extermination program, personally selecting arriving deportees for immediate murder rather than temporary work assignments, and reportedly conducting random killings within the camp for what survivors described as personal amusement. He was known as the Beast of Sobibor. Like Stangl, he escaped to South America after the war, settling in Brazil where he lived for decades. Unlike Stangl, he was never successfully prosecuted. When his identity was revealed in the late 1970s, Brazil's Supreme Court rejected extradition requests from West Germany, Austria, Poland, and Israel on technical grounds in 1979. Wagner was found stabbed to death in his Brazilian farmhouse on October 3, 1980, at the age of 69, under circumstances that were officially ruled a suicide, but that many observers found unconvincing, given the nature of his injuries. He had escaped justice entirely, in both the legal and the physical sense, having spent 35 years in comfortable South American obscurity. Klaus Barbie, known as the Butcher of Lyon for his activities as the head of the Gestapo in the French city of Lyon during the German occupation, presents a case with a particularly ugly additional dimension: the involvement of American intelligence services in sheltering a man they knew to be a war criminal because they found his anti-communist expertise useful. Born on October 25, 1913, in Bad Godesberg, Barbie joined the SS and the SD in the 1930s and was posted to Lyon in November 1942, where he oversaw a campaign of torture, deportation, and murder that claimed thousands of lives. His most notorious individual act was the rounding up and deportation to Auschwitz of 44 Jewish children who had been sheltered at the children's home at Isieux, none of whom survived. He also personally tortured and killed the French resistance leader Jean Moulin, the head of the General Council of the French Resistance, in 1943. After Germany's defeat, Barbie was recruited by the American Counterintelligence Corps, which knew his identity and his wartime record, but found his knowledge of communist networks sufficiently valuable to protect him from French attempts to locate and arrest him. He was spirited to South America in 1951 with American assistance and settled in Bolivia, where he lived under the name Klaus Altmann, working as a businessman and later as a security advisor to the Bolivian military government, a role in which he reportedly applied techniques of interrogation and repression he had learned in the SS. His identity was discovered by the Nazi hunters Serge and Beta Klaasfeld in 1971. But Bolivia refused extradition for another decade. He was eventually expelled from Bolivia in 1983 and delivered to France, where he was tried in Lyon beginning in 1987, convicted of crimes against humanity in July 1987, and sentenced to life imprisonment. He died in Lyon's St. Joseph Prison on September 25, 1991, at the age of 77. The revelation of American complicity in his post-war protection caused significant diplomatic embarrassment and prompted a formal apology from the United States government in 1983, a rare public acknowledgement that the Cold War's intelligence priorities had compromised the moral obligations of post-war justice. The broader question of how intelligence services on both sides of the Cold War used former SS personnel raises profoundly uncomfortable questions about the relationship between post-war justice and geopolitical calculation. The American experience with Barbie was not unique. Operation Paperclip, which recruited former German scientists and engineers for American defense and space programs, included individuals with significant SS connections. The Gehlen organization, established under the direction of former Wehrmacht intelligence chief Reinhard Gehlen, with American funding and operational support, employed large numbers of former SS and SD personnel as intelligence sources, on the basis that their knowledge of Soviet intelligence methods and their networks in Eastern Europe made them uniquely valuable in the new confrontation with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union engaged in parallel practices on its side of the Iron Curtain, recruiting former German intelligence personnel with East European connections. The result was that the same intelligence services that had been part of the SS apparatus responsible for mass murder found themselves integrated into the Cold War intelligence structures of the very nations that had fought and defeated the Third Reich. The moral cost of these arrangements was never seriously calculated at the time, and the documents that would allow it to be fully calculated only began to be declassified decades later. Reinhard Gehlen himself deserves mention as one of the most successful transitions from Nazi-era service to post-war prominence in the entire history of the Third Reich's aftermath. Born on April 3, 1902, Gehlen was not technically an SS officer, but served as the Wehrmacht's head of intelligence on the Eastern Front, heading the Foreign Army's East Department that analysed Soviet military capabilities throughout the war. His archives of intelligence on the Soviet Union were the most comprehensive in the German military system, and their transfer to American custody at the war's end, along with Gehlen's own cooperation, formed the basis of the agreement that led to the creation of the Organisation Gehlen, which became the Bundesnachrichtendienst, the West German Federal Intelligence Service, in 1956. Gehlen served as its first president until 1968. That a man who had spent the war years in the service of the Third Reich should have become the head of a founding institution of the Federal Republic of Germany says something important and disturbing about the practical calculations that governed the early post-war years. The personnel he recruited for his organization included not only former Wehrmacht officers but individuals with direct SS connections, men whose wartime activities would have disqualified them from any public position if those activities had been properly examined. They were not properly examined because proper examination was not what the Cold War required. By the 1970s and 1980s, as the generation that had fought the war began to age and die, and as a new generation of historians began to open the archives with fresh eyes and fewer of the inhibitions that had characterized the immediate post-war decades, a more honest picture of the SS and its post-war fate began to emerge. Historians like Martin Brossat, Raoul Hilberg and Christopher Browning applied rigorous archival methods to the documentation of how the SS had operated, how ordinary men had participated in mass murder, and how the post-war justice system had comprehensively failed to deliver proportionate consequences for most of those men. Raoul Hilberg's monumental work, The Destruction of the European Jews, first published in 1961 and in a greatly expanded form in 1985, established the administrative and logistical history of the Holocaust in forensic detail, demonstrating beyond any serious challenge that the SS and its constituent organizations had operated as a systematically designed machine of murder rather than a collection of individual criminal acts. Christopher Browning's Ordinary Men, published in 1992, examined the case of Reserve Police Battalion 101, a unit of middle-aged German policemen who participated in mass shootings in occupied Poland, demonstrating that the perpetrators of the Holocaust were not exclusively ideological fanatics or SS professionals, but included the full range of ordinary human types, a finding that made the question of post-war accountability both more urgent and more complicated. If anyone could have done what these men did, how do we identify and punish the specific individuals who actually did it, particularly when so many of them had hidden themselves so successfully in the texture of ordinary life? The question of what the German legal system owed to the survivors and the dead of the Holocaust was given a new urgency in the early 21st century by a legal innovation that had significant practical consequences. The recognition that anyone who had served at a known extermination or concentration camp could be charged as an accessory to murder, regardless of whether their specific individual acts could be documented. This theory of criminal liability, applied to the prosecution of John Demjanjuk in 2011 and upheld by German courts, opened the door to the prosecution of elderly former camp guards and other personnel who had previously been protected by the impossibility of documenting specific individual acts. In the following years, a series of prosecutions of very elderly defendants, including the Auschwitz bookkeeper Oskar Groening, whom we mentioned earlier, brought the question of SS accountability back into German public consciousness in a powerful way. These prosecutions were controversial, with some arguing that prosecuting men in their 90s who had no individual documented act of murder to their name served no useful penal purpose, and others arguing that the symbolic and historical importance of the proceedings was independent of any question of individual retribution. Whatever one's view of the legal and moral questions involved, the Demjanjuk precedent represented a significant late correction to the decades of legal inaction that had allowed most camp personnel to die in freedom. The story of the Waffen-SS in the post-war world would be incomplete without a return to the fundamental question with which our title confronts us. What is a traitor, and whose traitor was the man who hid in the English village? Eric Pleasance was, from the perspective of British law, a traitor to his country. He had worn the uniform of its enemy. He had, technically at least, placed himself at the disposal of the most destructive and morally bankrupt regime in modern European history. The British courts, having reviewed his case and the circumstances of his recruitment, chose not to prosecute him. And in that choice, they made a practical acknowledgement that the simple binary of loyalty and betrayal was inadequate to describe what had happened to a man caught between occupation, imprisonment, and the desperate human instinct to survive. From the perspective of the SS itself, he had never truly belonged. He had joined for reasons that had nothing to do with National Socialist ideology. He had served in a unit that never fired a shot in actual combat. He had been captured not in the defense of Nazi Germany, but in the chaos of its complete destruction. And he had then spent years in Soviet captivity, enduring conditions that were arguably as severe as those faced by many regular Waffen-SS soldiers on the Eastern Front. Was he Himmler's traitor, in the sense that he wore Himmler's uniform without believing in Himmler's cause, perhaps, in the sense that he betrayed the ideology the SS was supposed to embody? Certainly. The village he hid in after the war was not a refuge in the dramatic sense of a rat-lined safe house or a South American bolt hole. It was just home. It was England. It was the place he had tried to escape from when the Germans came, and which turned out, in the end, to be the place he returned to, as though the occupation, the SS, the Soviet camps, and the long years of silence had all been an extraordinarily expensive and painful detour back to the county he had started from. The final irony of the SS story, perhaps the most bitter irony of all, is that the organization's post-war survival in memory and in myth proved more resilient than its physical destruction in 1945 could have suggested. The Nuremberg Tribunal declared it a criminal organization. Its symbols are banned in Germany. Its ideology has been comprehensively refuted by history. And yet the revisionist literature produced by HIAG and its successors, the online communities that celebrate the Waffen-SS as elite warriors, the Eastern European commemorations of locally recruited divisions as national heroes, and the persistence of a certain romantic military mystique around the black uniform and the silver death's head insignia all represent a continuing battle over how the SS will be remembered. That battle is not between historians and Holocaust deniers, though that confrontation exists. It is a deeper battle over the basic human capacity to look honestly at what organizations and nations and ordinary people are capable of when ideology, obedience, and dehumanization combine. The SS was not composed primarily of monsters. It was composed primarily of people who made choices, who received orders, who told themselves the stories they needed to tell in order to do what they did, and who then, in the vast majority of cases, lived out long and unremarkable post-war lives in communities that chose collectively not to look too closely at what those stories concealed. The village where the traitor hid is every village in which someone who did terrible things simply kept quiet and waited for the world to move on. How many such villages are there? More than history has yet fully counted. The legacy of the Waffen-SS and its post-war dispersal continues to shape European politics and historical memory in ways both overt and subtle. In Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, the annual commemorations of SS veterans as national heroes have generated ongoing conflict between these countries' governments and the Jewish communities and organizations that regard such commemorations as a whitewashing of complicity in the Holocaust. In Ukraine, the historical role of locally recruited formations in SS atrocities has become entangled in contemporary political debates about national identity and the relationship with Russia that make honest historical reckoning extremely difficult. In Germany itself, the far-right AfD party has included politicians who have spoken positively about Wehrmacht and SS soldiers' service, triggering prosecutions under German law, and demonstrating that the political manipulation of wartime military history is not a phenomenon safely confined to the past. In Britain, the story of the British Free Corps and figures like Eric Pleasance remains barely known to the general public, a gap in the national historical memory that reflects the discomfort of confronting a dimension of the war that does not fit the heroic national narrative. The history of the SS after 1945 is, in other words, not really over. Its consequences are still working themselves out in court cases, in political controversies, in families that have never discussed what a grandfather did between 1939 and 1945, and in communities that are still, decades on, choosing between the comfort of forgetting and the discomfort of honest memory. What remains when all the individual cases have been traced and all the fates documented is a picture of profound moral inadequacy in the face of profound moral catastrophe. An organisation of nearly 1 million men that participated in the greatest programme of deliberate mass. Murder in recorded history produced in the post-war decades a relatively small number of serious criminal convictions, a substantially larger number of minor denazification penalties, a vast network of mutual support and historical revisionism, and a dispersion into the ordinary social fabric of European life so complete that most of its members lived out their days entirely undisturbed by the consequences of what they had been part of. The man who hid in the English village was not exceptional. He was, in his ordinariness, completely typical. That is both the most honest conclusion and the most disturbing one. Well, that is our story. The tale of Himmler's SS and what happened to the men who wore its uniform after the Third Reich collapsed is one of the most complicated and morally challenging stories that the Second World War has left us, full of individual fates that resist simple summary, questions that have no comfortable answers, and a continuing relevance to the present moment that makes it impossible to treat as simply history. We hope you found this exploration informative and that it gave you a deeper understanding of the human realities behind the headlines and the war crimes statistics. If you enjoyed learning about today's topic, make sure to check out our video on what happened to the German generals after World War II, where you will find many more extraordinary stories of survival, justice, and the very long shadow that the most destructive conflict in human history has cast over the decades that followed it. Do not forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you stay updated on all our new content. The history we make together, by remembering honestly and asking difficult questions, is the best guarantee against repeating the catastrophes of the past. See you in the next one.